You've heard the speech before. Maybe you're hearing it right now. I finally see what I've been doing to you. To everyone. I was blind, but now I understand. I'm going to therapy. I'm reading books. I'm doing the work. This time is different. The words land exactly where they're meant to, in that space between your exhausted heart and your stubborn hope. Every syllable crafted to slip past your defenses, to resurrect the possibility you've tried to bury. Maybe they really can change. Here's what makes this moment so dangerous. Sometimes, the person speaking these words believes them completely. They're not consciously lying. They're experiencing what feels like genuine revelation, authentic remorse, real commitment to transformation. Carl Jung spent 40 years studying what he called the architecture of personality defense, the sophisticated psychological structures that protect us from unbearable truths about ourselves. His most unsettling discovery wasn't about narcissistic behavior itself, but about the mind's capacity to simulate transformation while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Jung documented a phenomenon he termed defensive metamorphosis, the ability of deeply entrenched personality patterns to evolve, adapt, and even appear to transform while preserving their essential protective function. The narcissistic structure doesn't just resist change. It incorporates the appearance of change into its defensive repertoire. Think about what this means. The tears, the insight, the vocabulary of accountability, these might not be manipulation in the traditional sense. They might be the narcissistic defense system's most sophisticated strategy, becoming whatever it needs to become to maintain its core function of protecting against intolerable vulnerability. Jung observed that individuals with profound narcissistic adaptations often possess remarkable psychological sophistication. They can analyze their patterns with clinical precision, articulate their defenses with stunning clarity, and demonstrate what appears to be genuine self-awareness. But this sophistication serves a specific function: maintaining distance from the primal wounds that created the narcissistic structure in the first place. The question isn't whether narcissists can change. The question is whether what looks like change is actual transformation, or the defense system's latest evolution. And Jung discovered that distinguishing between these possibilities requires understanding something most people never learn: what authentic psychological transformation actually demands, and why the narcissistic structure is specifically designed to prevent it. In 1931, Carl Jung began working with a patient whose case would reshape his understanding of narcissistic psychology. The patient, we'll call him Frederick, presented as the perfect analyst and intelligent, motivated, seemingly committed to deep psychological work. Frederick could describe his childhood wounds with remarkable clarity. An emotionally absent father who only noticed achievements, a mother who oscillated between suffocating attention and cold withdrawal. The familiar origin story of narcissistic adaptation. But Carl Jung noticed something unsettling. Frederick's insight into his patterns never translated into actual change. He could explain why he manipulated others, but continued manipulating. He understood his need for admiration, but the need never diminished. He recognized his lack of empathy, but empathy never developed. Carl Jung realized he was witnessing something more complex than resistance. Frederick hadn't built defenses against the world. He had built an entire false identity that had completely replaced authentic selfhood. Carl Jung called this structural substitution. The false self wasn't a mask worn over the true self. It had become the only self Frederick could access. The authentic person who might have existed had been systematically dismantled and reconstructed as a performance of personhood. This false self served brilliantly adaptive functions. It protected Frederick from experiencing needs that had proven dangerous in childhood. It maintained relationships through strategic behavior rather than genuine connection. It provided a sense of identity that, while hollow, was preferable to the void underneath. But Carl Jung discovered the false self's most insidious quality. It could learn, adapt, and evolve to meet any challenge, including the challenge of therapy. Frederick didn't resist psychological work. He mastered it. He became an expert at performing insight, demonstrating growth, and producing the responses that suggested transformation. Carl Jung documented that Frederick would have breakthrough moments that seemed genuinely transformative. He would weep about his emptiness, rage about his childhood, express what appeared to be authentic remorse for harm caused. But these emotional displays, Carl Jung realized, were still products of the false self, sophisticated performances that maintained distance from actual vulnerability. The fortress of Frederick's false self wasn't built from denial or delusion. It was constructed from a more sophisticated material: the ability to know about feelings without feeling them, to understand patterns without being touched by them, to perform humanity without experiencing it. Carl Jung observed that this created a therapeutic paradox. Every intervention designed to reach Frederick's authentic self was intercepted and neutralized by the false self's defensive sophistication. The more psychologically educated Frederick became, the more impenetrable his defenses grew. The fortress had no weakness because it had no fixed structure. It could become whatever it needed to become: victim or aggressor, patient or expert, broken or healing, to maintain its essential function of preventing authentic encounter with the evacuated self beneath. Jung's breakthrough with Frederick came not through psychological technique, but through accidental discovery. During one session, Frederick mentioned in passing that he sometimes felt like a sophisticated algorithm programmed to produce human responses. This wasn't metaphor. Frederick was describing his actual experience of selfhood, or rather, the absence of selfhood where a person should exist. Jung realized that beneath Frederick's false self wasn't a wounded true self waiting to be discovered. There was what Jung called the developmental void, an absence where authentic selfhood should have formed, but never did. In early development, Frederick had faced what Jung termed an impossible psychological equation. Being authentically himself, expressing needs, showing vulnerability, having limitations, resulted in either dangerous parental rage or devastating emotional abandonment. But children need authentic expression for psychological development, like they need food for physical growth. Frederick's solution was unconsciously brilliant. He ceased to exist as an authentic person. Instead of developing a true self that would be constantly under threat, he developed a false self that could shapeshift to meet whatever demands the environment presented. But this adaptation came at an unimaginable cost. The normal developmental processes that create authentic selfhood, the gradual integration of experiences, emotions, and relationships into a coherent identity, never occurred. Frederick didn't have a wounded self. He had an absent self. Jung documented that when Frederick approached this void in therapy, he experienced what Jung called annihilation anxiety. Not fear of death, but fear of the nothingness that existed where a self should be. The false self's desperate defenses suddenly made sense. They weren't protecting a wounded person, but preventing encounter with an existential absence. This discovery changed Jung's understanding of narcissistic transformation. The question wasn't whether Frederick could heal his wounded true self. There was no true self to heal. The question was whether an authentic self could be developed for the first time in adulthood, after decades of living as a sophisticated simulation of personhood. Jung realized this would require something far more radical than traditional therapeutic healing. It would require what he called psychological genesis, the creation of selfhood from nothing, like building a house, not on damaged foundation, but on empty air. The implications were staggering. Frederick would need to experience infancy, childhood, and adolescence psychologically while maintaining adult responsibilities. He would need to develop basic capacities for feeling, connecting, and being that most people develop unconsciously in their first years of life. And most challenging of all, he would need to tolerate existing in the void, experiencing the nothingness where a self should be, long enough for authentic selfhood to begin forming. This meant voluntarily experiencing exactly what his entire psychological structure had been built to avoid. Jung identified specific conditions necessary for someone like Frederick to develop authentic selfhood from the void. These requirements were so demanding that Jung initially despaired of transformation being possible. First, Frederick would need what Jung called total defensive collapse. The false self's protective strategies would need to fail completely, not partially, not temporarily, but absolutely. This typically required cascading life catastrophes that couldn't be managed, manipulated, or rationalized away. But collapse alone wasn't sufficient. Jung observed that narcissistic structures often respond to failure by becoming more entrenched. Frederick's first response to loss was always intensification of false self-strategies. More sophisticated manipulation, more convincing performances, more elaborate psychological defenses. True transformation required a second condition: sustained, intolerable vulnerability. Frederick would need to remain in a state of complete psychological exposure, without defenses, without protection, without the false self's management, long enough for something authentic to emerge from the void. Jung documented that this state felt like psychological death to Frederick. Without the false self's constant performance, he didn't know how to exist. He described feeling like a ghost pretending to haunt its own life. The third requirement Jung identified was even more challenging: environmental impossibility. Frederick would need consistent, patient, non-retaliatory support from others while he learned basic human capacities. But his decades of narcissistic behavior had systematically destroyed relationships with anyone capable of providing such support. Jung realized this created a cruel paradox. The people most needing transformation had invariably created life circumstances that made transformation impossible. They needed love while learning to love, needed trust while learning to be trustworthy, needed patience while developing the capacity to reciprocate it. But Jung discovered a fourth requirement that explained why even perfect circumstances rarely produced transformation: meaning tolerance. Frederick would need to find reason to continue existing during the years it would take to develop authentic selfhood, years of feeling like nothing, being nothing, having nothing that felt real or meaningful. The false self had provided Frederick with grandiose meaning: being special, superior, beyond ordinary human limitations. Developing authentic selfhood meant accepting what Jung called the catastrophe of ordinariness, discovering that underneath all the grandiosity was just another human being, no more special than anyone else. Jung observed that this requirement often proved insurmountable. When Frederick began to glimpse his ordinary humanity, limited, flawed, mortal, the pull to reconstruct the false self became overwhelming. The grandiose delusion, even recognized as delusion, felt preferable to ordinary reality. These impossible requirements explained why Jung documented only 2 cases in 40 years of practice where profound narcissistic structures genuinely transformed. The conditions almost never align, and even when they do, the psychological endurance required exceeds most human capacity. What Jung discovered next revolutionized understanding of why narcissistic transformation appears to occur far more often than it actually does. When Frederick faced pressure to change, from family, consequences, or his own suffering, his false self didn't resist. Instead, it evolved what Jung called metamorphic mimicry, the ability to simulate transformation so convincingly that even experienced therapists could be deceived. Frederick learned to produce what looked like authentic change. He could generate appropriate emotional responses, demonstrate apparent insight, modify problematic behaviors, even show what seemed like genuine empathy. But Jung observed that these changes emerged from the false self's performance capability, rather than authentic development. Jung identified specific markers that distinguished simulated from authentic change. Simulated change required constant conscious management. Frederick had to remember to maintain his reformed behaviors. Authentic change emerged spontaneously from transformed inner structure. Simulated change was conditional. Frederick's improvements depended on external rewards or consequences. Authentic change persisted regardless of external response because it emerged from internal development rather than strategic calculation. Most tellingly, simulated change never addressed what Jung called the narcissistic prime directive, the absolute need for specialness. Frederick could modify his methods for obtaining narcissistic supply, but the fundamental need for external validation of his superiority never diminished. Jung documented Frederick's remarkable ability to simulate therapeutic progress. He would have sessions that seemed to represent profound breakthroughs, weeping about his emptiness, expressing apparent remorse for harm caused, demonstrating what looked like newfound self-awareness. But Jung noticed these breakthroughs followed predictable patterns. They occurred when Frederick faced consequences, needed to repair relationships, or felt his therapist losing faith in his progress. The timing revealed their strategic, rather than spontaneous, nature. More disturbing, Jung observed that Frederick genuinely believed his simulated changes were real. The false self's performance was so sophisticated that it convinced even Frederick himself. He would feel authentic remorse while expressing performed remorse, experience genuine commitment to change while enacting strategic transformation. This self-deception wasn't conscious manipulation. It was the false self's evolution to meet therapeutic challenge. Frederick's defensive structure had learned to produce whatever responses would maintain relational stability and avoid abandonment, including convincing displays of growth and change. Jung realized this created an almost unsolvable problem for anyone trying to assess narcissistic transformation. The simulation was often indistinguishable from authentic change, sometimes even to the person experiencing it. Only extended observation over years could reveal whether changes emerged from genuine development or sophisticated performance. After 3 years of analysis, something unprecedented occurred in Frederick's case. A series of cascading losses, divorce, estrangement from children, professional disgrace, created what Carl Jung had theorized, but never witnessed: complete defensive collapse with survival necessity. Frederick couldn't retreat into grandiosity because reality refused to cooperate. He couldn't perform his way to stability because everyone who mattered had learned to recognize his performances. He couldn't maintain his false self because it required more energy than his depleted system possessed. Carl Jung documented what happened next with scientific precision, knowing he might never witness it again. Frederick entered what Carl Jung called the catastrophic void, direct encounter with the nothingness where selfhood should exist. For weeks, Frederick could barely function. He described feeling like smoke, trying to pretend it's solid. Without the false self's organizing performance, he didn't know how to have conversations, make decisions, or even experience basic preferences. He had to learn what he actually liked versus what the false self had performed liking. Carl Jung observed Frederick slowly developing what most people form in infancy: basic affect recognition. Frederick had to learn to identify physical sensations as emotions, to connect those emotions to experiences, to tolerate feeling without immediately defending against it. This process was agonizing. Every authentic feeling that emerged threatened Frederick's entire defensive architecture. Genuine sadness meant admitting real loss. Authentic fear meant acknowledging actual vulnerability. True loneliness meant recognizing decades of disconnection. But Carl Jung documented something remarkable. As Frederick learned to tolerate these feelings, microscopic moments of authentic selfhood began forming. Not the dramatic breakthrough of a hidden true self emerging, but the tentative development of genuine experience where nothing had existed before. Frederick's first authentic preference, genuinely enjoying coffee rather than performing sophisticated coffee appreciation, took 4 months to develop. His first spontaneous emotional response, laughing at something genuinely funny rather than laughing strategically, emerged after 6 months. Carl Jung observed that Frederick's authentic development followed infant-like patterns. He had to learn emotional object permanence, that feelings could exist without destroying him. He had to develop basic trust, that others could know his limitations without abandoning him. He had to build fundamental identity, preferences, responses, and experiences that belonged to him rather than his performance. This development was neither linear nor stable. Frederick would make genuine progress, then retreat into false self patterns when the vulnerability became intolerable. Each retreat required starting over, rebuilding from nothing. Carl Jung documented that Frederick's transformation, such as it was, took 7 years of intensive work under ideal circumstances. Even then, the changes remained fragile. The false self's patterns, built over 40 years, could reassert themselves during stress. The authentic self, newly formed and tentative, required constant protection and support. Jung's work with Frederick revealed a crucial challenge for anyone trying to assess narcissistic transformation. How do you recognize authentic change when sophisticated simulation is indistinguishable from genuine development? Jung identified what he called transformation markers, indicators that suggested actual structural change rather than defensive evolution. But he emphasized these markers only become reliable through extended observation, often over years. The first marker was unconscious authenticity. Frederick's genuine changes appeared in tiny, unconscious moments, a spontaneous expression of preference, an unguarded emotional response, a genuine reaction that served no strategic purpose. These moments were brief, subtle, and easily missed. The second marker was developmental regression. As Frederick developed authentic selfhood, he displayed age-inappropriate emotional responses, tantrums like a toddler, attachment needs like an infant, identity confusion like an adolescent. This regression horrified Frederick, but indicated genuine development rather than performance. The third marker was narcissistic supply indifference. Frederick gradually lost interest in admiration, superiority, and special treatment. This wasn't performed humility. He simply stopped needing external validation to maintain psychological stability. His developing authentic self generated internal worth. Jung documented that the most reliable marker was voluntary ordinariness. Frederick began choosing ordinary experiences, simple pleasures, regular relationships, everyday activities, without feeling diminished. He could be average without experiencing it as annihilation. But Jung observed that these markers created their own problems. Frederick's genuine transformation made him less interesting, less charismatic, less intensely present. People who had been attracted to his narcissistic intensity found his authentic self boring. His ex-wife, who had hoped for transformation for years, discovered she didn't actually like who Frederick became. His authentic self was quieter, simpler, less ambitious than his grandiose, false self. She had fallen in love with a performance and felt betrayed by the ordinary person who emerged. Jung realized this revealed another obstacle to transformation. The narcissistic false self often attracts partners who need the drama, intensity, and specialness it provides. Authentic transformation disappoints these unconscious needs, creating pressure to return to false self-patterns. Frederick's children struggled with different confusion. They had developed their entire relational strategies around managing his narcissism. When he genuinely changed, they didn't know how to relate to him. His authentic accountability triggered rage about years of harm. His genuine emotions felt manipulative because they resembled previous performances. Jung documented that Frederick's transformation, while real, didn't repair the damage his narcissism had caused. Authenticity didn't entitle him to forgiveness. Development didn't erase impact. Growth didn't guarantee relationship restoration. This reality check often triggered what Jung called transformation collapse, the temptation to return to false self-patterns when authentic development didn't produce hoped-for rewards. Frederick had to learn to value growth for its own sake, rather than for what it might gain him. Let's return to this moment. Someone with narcissistic patterns sitting across from you, tears streaming, promising change, possibly even believing their own promise. Carl Jung's research delivers an uncomfortable truth. Genuine narcissistic transformation is vanishingly rare, requiring conditions that almost never align, and psychological endurance that few possess. The tears might be real, emerging from genuine distress about consequences. The commitment might be sincere, reflecting authentic desire to avoid pain. The insight might be accurate, demonstrating intellectual understanding of patterns. But none of these indicate the structural transformation necessary for sustainable change. Carl Jung documented that in 40 years of practice, he witnessed 2 cases of profound narcissistic transformation. 2. And both required perfect storms of circumstances, complete defensive collapse, sustained therapeutic support, minimal life stressors, and extraordinary psychological resilience. Even Frederick's transformation, the more successful case, took 7 years of intensive work and remained fragile. The false self patterns, developed over decades, could reassert themselves during stress. The authentic self required constant protection and conscious maintenance. But Carl Jung's research reveals something even more important. You don't need to determine whether transformation is possible to make healthy decisions about your own life. The question, can they change, often serves as sophisticated avoidance of the more relevant question, is this relationship acceptable to me as it currently exists? Focusing on potential transformation keeps you trapped in hope rather than responding to present reality. Carl Jung observed that partners of narcissistic individuals often develop their own defensive patterns, organizing their lives around managing the narcissist's responses, finding meaning in being needed, deriving identity from their capacity to endure. These patterns don't automatically resolve if the narcissist transforms. Your healing doesn't depend on their transformation. Your growth doesn't require their recognition. Your worth doesn't need their validation. Carl Jung documented that people who focused on their own development, regardless of the narcissist's capacity for change, created better outcomes than those who waited for transformation. The person making promises might genuinely want to change. They might even believe change is happening. But wanting and believing don't create the structural transformation necessary to sustain different patterns. Carl Jung's research suggests that energy spent assessing transformation potential is better invested in clarifying your own boundaries, healing your own patterns, and making decisions based on current reality rather than future possibility. The promise of change will always be seductive because it offers hope without requiring difficult decisions. But Jung's work reveals that genuine transformation is so rare, requires such specific conditions, and takes so long that basing life decisions on its possibility is essentially gambling against impossible odds. Frederick transformed, but it took 7 years, cost him everything, and required conditions that rarely exist. His transformation was real, but didn't repair relationships, didn't erase harm, didn't entitle him to restoration of what narcissism had destroyed. The tears, the promises, the apparent sincerity. These might represent the best the person can offer within their current structure. But Carl Jung's research makes clear the best someone can offer within narcissistic structure is not the same as genuine transformation. Your life doesn't need to wait for someone else's unlikely metamorphosis. Carl Jung's work gives you permission to make decisions based on what is rather than what might, theoretically, possibly, under perfect conditions, become. So here's the question that matters. If you knew with absolute certainty that the narcissistic person in your life would never fundamentally change, what would you do differently starting today? Your answer reveals what you already know, but might be avoiding. Share your recognition below. Your clarity might help others stop waiting for impossible transformations and start building lives based on reality. Subscribe to explore more of Carl Jung's research into personality structures and the rare conditions that enable genuine psychological transformation. Understanding what change actually requires and why it so rarely occurs provides the clarity needed to make healthy decisions regardless of another person's capacity for growth.